he's not our usual Dharma team member, but I'm very delighted that he said yes to giving a talk in this series that we're doing on Sangharakshita. He is a very interesting person, if you don't mind me saying.
Yeah. Mind?
He was ordained in 1992, which is and he got in contact with the Dharma and Triratna back in New Zealand 40 years ago. So he has, and he's been a very faithful and consistent practitioner. He goes deep, Simamati. He goes deep. But he goes deep and but he also goes broad. So he knew Sangharakshita a little bit. So I'm looking forward to hearing, little bits and pieces from, what you knew. You didn't know him hugely well. You didn't spend lots of time with him, but you knew him over years and years, bits and pieces. But Samamati is very engaged with the ordination training process in Mexico. Didn't expect that. So he speaks really good Spanish. And he's lived in Mexico a bit, but he also speaks Chinese. Yeah, you say that. And he's and he's off to Taiwan in a few weeks' time. There's an order member living in Taiwan, and they're going to be leading a course in Buddhism, meditation, mindfulness in Taiwan. So Samamachi is going to go and help him. So like a man of sort of wide interests, but sort of deep valleys as well. So thank you very much for coming to give us this talk. I'll let you introduce the talk.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's nice getting some applause at the beginning. Might not get it at the end. No. So yes, thanks. Actually, I was reminded just before the class, chatting with Amarchandra, of my first meeting with Sangharakshita, which was 33 years ago, almost to the day, to the week anyway. I had arrived in the UK a few weeks earlier, at the beginning of March, early March 1991. And on the 24th of March, or thereabouts, it was the first anniversary of the death of Dada Rinpoche, who was one of Sangharakshita's 6 Tibetan teachers and a good friend of Sangharakshita. And it was quite a special moment because the year before in New Zealand, I met Subhuti, who ended up being my preceptor the year afterwards. So it was kind of like, for me, a kind of a cascade of Kalyana Mitrata. There was Dada Rinpoche, a good friend of Sangharakshita, Subhuti, and I was with a good friend, we were both Mitras at the time, Richard and myself, and we got ordained the following year. He became Sagaravajra. So we were good friends together with our good friend Subhuti and Sangharakshita and Dada Rinpoche. So it just made me think of like the Buddhist tradition as being this kind of lineage of friendship, of Kalyana Mitrata that goes all the way back, in this case from myself to Subhuti, Bhante, Sangharakshita, Dada Rinpoche, and the whole of the Buddhist tradition, right back to the Buddha himself. So friendship, spiritual friendship is very much a part of the Buddhist tradition. I was just reminded of that. And it's been very, very close to the heart of Sangharakshita. I'm just going to start with a quote, an excerpt from a talk that he gave in India about 40 or 50 years ago, in which it makes it very clear, what he feels about human relationships and friendship in particular. So I'll just read this opening little reading. This is one of the reasons why I am a Buddhist. I believe that humanity is basically one. I believe that it is possible for any human being to communicate with any other human being, to feel for any other human being, to be friends with any other human being. This is what I truly and deeply believe. This belief is part of my own experience. It is part of my own life. It is part of me. I cannot live without this belief, and I would rather die than give it up. So that's Sangharakshita is, making it very clear where he stands on friendship. Yeah. Now, some of you may not be familiar with Sangharakshita in his life, so I'm going to just say a few words about leading up to the first part of his life, where he met the first of the friends that I'm going to talk about. So he was born in Tooting in South London to a rather ordinary sort of lower socioeconomic family, I suppose to say these days. Quite an ordinary sort of childhood, though he was obviously quite exceptional and intelligent. At the age of 8, he was diagnosed with a heart condition, and the remedy for that was to keep immobile as much as possible. So he went to bed for 2 years and wasn't allowed to do anything. But he had a very, very keen intellect, so he wanted to read as much as possible. And his parents had a real hard job kind of keeping up with his voracious appetite for reading. I think the Children's Encyclopedia of, I don't know how many volumes, slowed him down for a bit. But anyway, so that was, and reading was always a very, lifelong sort of passion for Sangharakshita. He was, although he's brought up in a sort of a Christian, nominally Christian family, he, at the age of 14, I think it was, 14, 15, he read a book called Isis Unveiled by Madame Blavatsky. And reading this book, he realized he was not a Christian, that the whole sort of Christian theology was just, I think he said, even repugnant to him in a way. A couple of years later, when he was 16, he read 2 Buddhist sutras, which had a very, very profound effect on him, the Diamond Sutra and the Sutra of Huineng. And he realized that he was a Buddhist, and he says that he always had been a Buddhist. That's how he felt about it. So that was his realization that he was a Buddhist at the age of 16. Soon after that, he started going to the not the Buddhist Center, the Buddhist Society in London, and by some amazing fluke, yes, so he had those 2 years in bed, but then he was re-diagnosed and his heart was said to be kind of okay. But anyway, he passed the army medical examination and was drafted into the army. Did you say that? Conscripted or something. So he was 18, I think, at that time. The following year, 1944, when he was 19, thereabouts, 18, 19, he was put on a ship and just taken away, a whole lot of other army people, soldiers and stuff. And of all places he went to was to India, which he just couldn't believe, being taken to the land of the Buddha's birth was just a miracle to him. So he ended up in India and spent the next couple of years in India, in Sri Lanka, and in Singapore on various sort of postings with the army. He was in the Signal Corps, so he didn't go around shooting people and that, which is a good thing. Yeah. So when he was in Singapore, he became vegetarian and was vegetarian for the rest of his life, his long life. And also he started practicing meditation there. So in those 2 or 3 years, he was meeting all sorts of people and, kind of getting to know the East and getting to know himself as a Buddhist. One of the people he met was the first of the friends that I'm going to talk about. And I'll just read Sangharakshita's own account of that. So Rabindra Kumar Banerjee, that's his name, Banerjee, was a tall, well-built Bengali in the prime of manhood. From the moment we were introduced to each other, we were friends. Like me, he was in khaki, that is in the army, but on his epaulettes, he wore the tricolored insignia of the Indian National Congress. Being of a frank, communicative nature, with more than a touch of naive boastfulness, it was not long before he was telling me about himself without either restraint or reserve. Politics were the passion of his life. Though born in an Orthodox Brahmin family, he was an avowed enemy of the caste system and neither believed in nor practiced any form of social discrimination. Religion he violently condemned, probably because it was at that time identified in his mind with the inhuman social system sanctioned by the tradition to which by birth he belonged. Nevertheless, discerning beneath his anti-religious outbursts a strong ethical motivation, I not only spoke to him about religion, but lent him books on Vedanta to read, in the hope that these would prepare his mind for the eventual reception of Buddhism. So that's a brief introduction to his first friend, Banerjee. So from there, Sangharakshita, he was about 20 or 21 then. He technically deserted from the army. He had heard that if he went back to Britain, it would be next to impossible to leave Britain, because all hands were needed on deck to rebuild the country. So he technically deserted and went back to India and kind of disappeared into Indian society, really. Became, almost indistinguishable from an Indian eventually. Anyway, he met up with Banerjee there in India, and they went to various kind of Buddhist and Hindu organizations, including a Hindu ashram led by a female guru named Anandamayi, and they spent a few months with her and her kind of entourage in that ashram, Hindu ashram. There's a very interesting story that he relates in the Thousand Petal Lotus, or the Rainbow Road. He and Banerjee would meditate daily together in the early morning, probably before it was light. And Banerjee used to get up before Sangharakshita in the morning, and he'd wake him up with a shove on his shoulder, just time to wake up and meditate. So that was their custom. Anyway, one time Banerjee went off to New Delhi, quite a long way away, hundreds of miles, I think. And not the first night, but the night after he went there, Sangharakshita was sleeping, and he felt the customary, shove on his shoulder, and so he kind of gradually sort of woke up and bleary-eyed in that, and opened his mosquito net and saw Banerjee sitting there meditating, and he said, "Oh, okay, it's time to meditate." He was still, pretty groggy from being asleep, but he noticed a very strange thing, that he was sitting on this kind of string bed, which hadn't been there the night before. So he's starting to feel a bit uneasy by this time. And anyway, so he was about 3 feet away, he said, about a meter, and so he gradually just extended his arm to touch him on the shoulder. And as soon as his arm made contact with the shoulder, he just disappeared. So it was kind of like this just vision of Banerjee meditating. A few days later, when they met up again, they talked about this, and that night Banerjee had been unable to sleep. He was quite restless, so he got up about 1 in the morning and meditated. Actually, I forgot to mention that after the disappearance of the image figure, Banerjee checked his clock. It was pitch dark, but by the phosphorescent lights of this clock, he saw it was 2 in the morning. Anyway, so it kind of shows to me, well, Sangharakshita just describes these kinds of events that happen in his life and doesn't try to explain them. So I'll leave it to you to make of that what you will. Yeah. Anyway, yes, they got increasingly fed up with these Buddhist and Hindu organizations. They just thought people were corrupt and false, and they just got really disillusioned with them. So they both decided to go forth in quite a decisive kind of way. So I'll just read you and to kind of leave all organized religion behind completely and go off as wandering ascetics. So he was still just 21, 22 at the time. So this is what he writes about his going forth. Having made this resolution to go forth, we lost no time putting it into effect. With the help of a handful of Geroa-mati, the reddish-brown earth used since time immemorial by Indian ascetics, we dyed our shirts and sarongs the traditional saffron of the world renunciant. Suitcases and watches were sold, trousers, jackets, and shoes given away. Identification papers destroyed. Apart from the robes which we were to wear, we kept only a blanket each and our books and notebooks. As for the last 3 months, hair and beard had been allowed to grow. We did not need shaving tackle. At the time of our departure from Kasauli, where they were, it was raining, and that was up in the hills in northern India. But as in the course of our descent to the plains, we emerged from the clouds into the bright sunshine below, we saw, arching the road at intervals of a few dozen yards, not only single, but double and triple rainbows. Every time we turned a bend, we found more rainbows waiting for us. We passed through them as though through the multicolored arcades of some celestial palace. Against the background of bright sunshine, jewel-like glittering raindrops, and hills of the freshest and most vivid green, this plethora of delicate, seven-hued bows seemed like the epiphany of another world. Yeah, so that was his experience of going forth in a very decisive way. So they set off from Kasauli and walked down to the south of India with the intention of going to Sri Lanka to get ordained as Theravada bhikkhus. By some good or bad fortune, Sangharakshita wasn't allowed to enter into Sri Lanka because he'd destroyed his identification papers, as we heard here. And so they spent the next kind of year and a half, a bit more, in the south of India, particularly in a deserted and I believe haunted ashram, which so they stayed there for 2 years, nearly, a year and a half, practicing the Dharma, meditating, getting to know people, and there's lots of kind of quite interesting experiences that he writes about from that period. Towards the end of that time, they decided it's time to kind of move on and start seeking ordination as bhikkhu, Buddhist monks. So they set off traveling, and they meet quite a number of very interesting gurus and saints and the Hindu practitioners of the time, swamis and all the rest of it. One thing I haven't mentioned so far is that Banerjee was a very strong-willed, very emotional, very intense person, and he had a huge kind of he suffered from, I think, probably mental instability of some kind. He was very, very prone to take offense, and so Sangharakshita had to be quite careful about how they discussed things and to avoid kind of contentious issues or things that they might disagree on. It's a couple of incidents that he mentions where Sangharakshita, just too late in the course of a discussion, realized that Banerjee was getting more and more angry and furious, and on one occasion Banerjee struck Sangharakshita a blow on the face, and he had a black eye for a week and lost feeling in the side of his face for several years, he said. So that was one occasion. Another occasion, a bit later on, when they were doing that traveling, they were staying at a Hindu temple, and there was a kind of a bathing pool nearby, very cold water, and not very large, but very, very deep, he said. And they got into one of these arguments, and Banerjee at one point was trying to drown Sangharakshita. He was just absolutely furious. And Sangharakshita knew he meant it, that he really was going to drown him. He doesn't know quite how they got out of that, but anyway, he lived. So there was that side to their friendship, which is really quite very, very challenging for Sangharakshita. Anyway, they managed to get ordained as novice monks at Kusinara, where the Buddha died, had his parinirvana. And soon after that, Sangharakshita, they parted. Buddharakshita, that was Banerjee was ordained as Buddharakshita, went off to Sri Lanka and had a very difficult time. It was kind of like this clash between his intense nature and character with the orthodoxy of Theravada Buddhism in Sri Lanka. Anyway, it was and Sangharakshita studied for 6 months at a university there with his first teacher, Jagdish Kashyap, an Indian Theravada bhikkhu. And I'll just read a little bit about what he says about when they parted company, he and Buddharakshita, Banerjee. Though I was sorry to lose my warm-hearted but irascible companion, once the actual parting was over, my predominant feeling was one of relief. Living with Buddha Rakshita, Banerjee, had at times been a nightmare, and it was only now that I was once more on my own that I realized how great the strain had been. True, since our ordination, he had been easier to get on with. And seeing him better tempered than he had been for a long time, I had begun to entertain hopes that the demon by which he was periodically afflicted had been permanently exorcised. These hopes were soon shattered. I'll just leave that hanging. There's another story there, obviously. Yeah. So after these sort of 6 or 8 months studying with Jagdish Kashyap, the bhikkhu, they went on a tour of northeastern India and ended up in the town of Kalimpong in the Himalayan foothills of northeastern India. And Kashyap, his teacher, said, Sangharakshita's teacher, said to him, "Stay here and work for the good of Buddhism." This was in early 1950. So he was just 24, suddenly finding himself on his own completely, not knowing anyone in Kalimpong, and being asked to stay and work for the good of Buddhism. So he stayed there for the next 14 years. So he started doing lots of things, meeting lots of people. And one of the things he did was set up a little sort of Buddhist magazine with articles by, prominent writers in Buddhism, including himself, I suppose. Well, very much so. And one of the writers was a German Lama called Lama Govinda. Lama Govinda had lived in India for a number of years, but he was from Germany originally. And actually, he's written a very interesting book called The Way of the White Clouds, which is his account of traveling to Western Tibet in the 1930s with his wife, Lee Gotami. And they were both artists, and they took, sketches and that of a lot of the frescoes in the temples, which probably soon after disappeared. So, but it's a fascinating book if you get to see that. Anyway, so Sangharakshita got to know him, first of all, through his writings and then through letters that they exchanged. And he invited him up to Kalimpong. So I'll just read the bit from his memoirs about that meeting. When one has looked forward to meeting two people as much as I had been looking forward to meeting Lama Govinda and Lee Gotami, his wife, there is always the possibility of mutual disappointment. In the event, this was far from being the case. Within half an hour of their arrival at the hermitage, where he was living, a definite rapport had been established between us, and we were talking as freely as though we had known each other for years. It was as though in the course of the 5 days that my two guests spent with me in Kalimpong, as well as the 7 days that I spent with them in Darjeeling immediately afterwards, Lama Govinda and I ranged over practically the whole field of Buddhist thought and practice. On whatever topic we happened to touch, we found ourselves in agreement to an extent that would have been surprising had we not been familiar with each other's writings, and had we not already exchanged ideas in a number of letters. Indeed, as the cloudless autumn days went by, my feeling that we were kindred spirits received more abundant confirmation than I had dared to hope, and I was left in no doubt whatever that, despite the fact that he was a married Lama and I was a celibate monk, I had more in common with Lama Govinda than with any other Buddhist I had ever met. One of the most important topics on which we touched was that of the relation between Buddhism and the spiritual life on the one hand, and literature and the fine arts on the other. Besides being a Buddhist by conviction, Lama Govinda was himself an artist and poet of no small repute. He had held exhibitions of his paintings in a number of major Indian cities and had brought out 2 small volumes of poetry in his native German. For my part, I had written poetry since the age of 11 or 12, and was even now thinking of putting together some of my more recent poems for publication in book form. The fact that Lama Govinda and I cultivated literature and the fine arts did not, however, mean that he painted pictures or that I wrote poems in addition to doing such specifically Buddhist things as observing the precepts, meditating, studying the Dharma, and giving lectures. For him, as for me, the painting of pictures and the writing of poems was an integral part of the spiritual life itself. For this reason, there could be no question of the cultivation of literature and the fine arts being inconsistent with the practice of Buddhism and the living of the spiritual life, as I had been led to suppose, much less still of the one being actually inimical to the other. Yeah, so that was quite a sort of revelation to Sangharakshita, although he had a very, very strong feeling for the arts of all their kinds. I think there, you know, there was some doubt in his mind whether how it fitted into spiritual life. But finding someone who practiced them, both of them deeply, the Dharma life and an artistic life, was quite a relief to him to meet someone to share that sort of interest and affinity. Yeah. Yeah. So I hope the theme that's emerging in this talk is the really positive effect that these friendships had on Sangharakshita in the direction of his life. So in the first friendship, we saw that he went forth in a very, very decisive way through the friendship with Banerjee Buddharakshita, in a way that it might have taken him years to make that sort of progress, shall we say. And in this case, you know, discovery of the importance of the arts in the spiritual life was also a big revelation, as well as just being a great relief to, as he said, he was the best Buddhist friend that he'd ever met up to that point. So that's a little bit about Lama Govinda. So, yes, Sangharakshita arrived in Kalimpong in 1950. In 1952, he met probably, I think, his first, who turned out to be his first Tibetan teacher, Dada Rinpoche. Dada Rinpoche was Tibetan, from Eastern Tibet originally, and he was asked to go to India, initially to Bodh Gaya by the Dalai Lama, to be the abbot at Bodh Gaya. Bodh Gaya is the place where the Buddha realized awakening under the Bodhi tree. And then he ended up in Kalimpong. So they kind of bumped into each other now and again for the next few years. So he met him in 1952, and they'd meet over things like there was a dispute between two parties, and Sangharakshita would meet Dada Rinpoche to help sort it out a bit. And also he was involved in a translation of basically a book that Dada Rinpoche was, I think, dictating to another Tibetan monk, and then Bhante was kind of polishing the English. So this other Tibetan was writing English. Yeah. So they'd kind of interacted a bit over that, but they hadn't become close friends by that stage. In 1956, it was what's known as the Buddha Jayanti, which is the 2500th anniversary of the Parinirvana, or the death of the Buddha, as reckoned by certain calendars. There's other ones as well, but that was the officially recognized one at the time. So, you know, there were great celebrations in the Buddhist world around that date. And one thing that happened was that the Indian government, you know, they recognized, of course, knew that the Buddha was born in India, so he's regarded in India as a great figure of Indian history. So they offered this sort of tour to, how do they put it, eminent Buddhists from the border areas. So that was, so there were quite a number of Buddhists from, the border areas of northern India. And Sangharakshita and Dada Rinpoche were invited to represent the Buddhists of Kalimpong. So off they went in this train, mainly around all sorts of places of India. They'd go to government projects like dams and power stations and that kind of thing, and be shown around them. But also to all sorts of holy sites, temples and other sort of maybe caves and places like that. Hindu, I suppose, Buddhist if there were any at the time. Yes, of course, Buddhist ones as well. Yeah, so they and on this tour of lasted I think a couple of weeks, they got to know each other much better. They shared, you know, they'd travel together on the bus or on the train. So I'm just going to read a little thing about that Sangharakshita says about Dada Rinpoche from that tour. During the week that we were on tour and the 4 days we were in Delhi, Dada Rinpoche and I occupied the same compartment in the train. Living as we did in such close proximity, sharing meals and going on excursions together, I certainly got to know Dada Rinpoche better. I saw that he was adaptable, that he did not stand on his dignity as an incarnate Lama, and that he had a lively sense of humor. Above all, I saw how uniformly kind he was, how unfailingly mindful. His mindfulness consisted not merely in an absence of anything resembling forgetfulness or inattention, but also in a degree of foresight and preparedness that was almost supernatural. There occurred an incident which strikingly exemplified this particular quality of his. It was the custom of the officials who were looking after the party and organizing its transport to tell us which places we would be visiting that day. One morning, they told us we would be visiting a certain dam in the morning, and in the afternoon, after returning to the train for lunch, a certain holy place. Unfortunately, there was somehow a mix-up. An hour after leaving the train, we found ourselves not at the dam, as we had expected, but at the holy place. This in itself did not really matter, but thinking we would not be needing them until the afternoon, none of us had brought any candles or incense. None of us, that is, except Dada Rinpoche. As we were lamenting the fact that we would be unable to offer worship in the proper manner, he produced packets of candles and bundles of incense sticks from beneath his voluminous robes and smilingly distributed them amongst us. As I was to say in later years, Dada Rinpoche was never caught napping. And apparently there was just the right amount for everybody to go around. Yeah. So he was always prepared like that. So that was 1956. So Sangharakshita stayed another 8 years in Kalimpong in India and continued his work, particularly from that time onwards when the great ex-untouchable leader Dr. Ambedkar died. Sangharakshita continued his work in the plains amongst hundreds of thousands of former untouchable people. Yes, and then I'll mention soon what happened in 1964. But in 1962, Sangharakshita felt the need to take on another kind of commitment in his Dharma life. I'll read what he says here, which involves Dada Rinpoche. I had been attracted to the Bodhisattva ideal for almost as long as I had been a Buddhist, and I had been a Buddhist for 20 years by this time. There were two reasons for my being so strongly affected. In the first place, there was the sheer unrivaled sublimity of the Bodhisattva ideal, the ideal of dedicating oneself for innumerable lifetimes to the attainment of supreme enlightenment for the benefit of all living beings. In the second, there was the fact that, as enjoined by my teacher Kashyapji, I was working for the good of Buddhism, and that I could not do this without strong spiritual support, the more especially since I received very little real help or cooperation from those who were supposedly working with me. This spiritual support I found in the Bodhisattva ideal, which provided me with an example on the grandest possible scale of what I was myself trying to do within my own infinitely smaller sphere and on an infinitely lower level. So he took the Bodhisattva ordination from Dada Rinpoche, and he says, the ordination took place at the old Bhutan Palace. After the ceremony, I felt I was no longer merely an admirer of the Bodhisattva ideal. I was now committed to the realization of that ideal in my own life. In other words, I had been formally enrolled as a member of the Mahayana Sangha. This did not mean that I had abandoned the Hinayana, into one of whose schools I had been ordained as a monk, but only that the Hinayana had been integrated into the much wider context of the Mahayana. So that's a bit about Dada Rinpoche. We'll have to leave him there because I need to move on. Yes, but yeah, he was a very good friend of Sangharakshita, the closest friend that he had of his 8 main teachers in India at the time. Yeah. So sometime in 1964, he was invited to come to London, to the UK, to help kind of sort out a dispute between the 2 main Buddhist organizations of the time in London. I say the 2 main or major ones, but actually they're probably quite very small at the time. So one was a Thai tradition monastic organization, well, with a associated lay sangha called well, they were based in Hampstead, in the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara. And the other one was the Buddhist Society, which Sangharakshita had been to 20 years earlier. And that was led by, there's kind of a loose, eclectic sort of society studying all kinds of things, including not strictly Buddhist ones, probably, with a strong emphasis on Zen, I think, led by Christmas Humphreys. So Sangharakshita agreed to go to London for just a few months, he was thinking, sort of 4 to 6 months, and then go back to India. He agreed to that. So he ends up there, I think, about in the middle of 1964, into a very different kind of England, Britain, than he left 20 years earlier. Very, very, very different. The 60s, were beginning to swing by that time. Yeah. Anyway, so he spent a lot of time giving lectures on all sorts of topics, most of which we have available to us today in his books and that now. Meeting lots of people, visiting other Buddhist groups around the country, very, very small groups, but he'd go where he was invited to. One of the lectures he gave was on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And you may know that according to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, at the moment of death, there's a pure, clear light, that often the white light that appears, and it's the light of awakening, the Dharmakaya, just for an instant, perhaps. Anyway, I just mentioned that because it relates to the 4th friend that I want to talk about. So after the lecture, several members of the audience came and spoke to me. The last person to come was a tall young man, he was about 30 at the time, in a dark 3-piece suit, who had been sitting in the front row making notes, and whom I had seen once or twice before. I just wanted to tell you, he said, that I have seen the pure white light. Had almost anyone else made such a startling claim, I would have been inclined to think he was either crazy or a charlatan. But so unassuming was the young man's demeanor, so frank and trustful his gaze that it was impossible for me not to believe that he spoke the truth. What reply I made, I do not remember. Probably I simply acknowledged his communication in a way that showed him I took it seriously. So after that, they began to meet up and had very long and deep conversations about all sorts of things, and Sangharakshita got to know him very, very well. He then says, thus began a friendship that was to have important consequences for the rest of my life, and through me, for the future of British Buddhism. Yeah, so Sangharakshita found it that Terry, this is Terry Delamere, was a very exceptional person, very intelligent, very sensitive and aware, but also had a very strong tendency to depression and a very strong inferiority complex in a way. He had a very difficult childhood. His father was actually the nephew of the poet Walter Delamere. So Terry was the great nephew of Walter Delamere. Anyway, his father was a strong disciplinarian and very, very hard, really, and not sort of very sensitive to his son. And his mother was hypochondriac and depressive. So, but outwardly, Terry seemed to maintain and live a very sort of normal, happy, successful life. He held down a good job, made quite good money. He had an ex-wife and a daughter. I think she was just 3 years old at the time. And then had other girlfriends as well. Yeah, but beneath all that, Terry was very, very disturbed in some ways and had a tendency to depression. Yeah, and so Sangharakshita used to have to sort of talk him out of quite difficult mental states at times. Anyway, they became one feature of their friendship was Terry related to Sangharakshita not as a monk, just as an ordinary human being, and even used his civil name at times, which not out of disrespect or anything like that, but this was a great relief to Sangharakshita to have somebody that he could relate to who didn't sort of treat him as the venerable Sangharakshita, just somebody wearing a robe, and so that was a huge relief for Sangharakshita to be able to relate to somebody just as an ordinary sort of human being there. So kind of through his friendship with Terry, Sangharakshita began to, little by little, kind of let go of some of the trappings of an orthodox Theravadan monk. He'd been very strict in terms of like not eating after midday for all the time he was a monk, and so on. So he began to sort of eat after midday, which is strictly against the Vinaya, the rules of the monks, and he also started wearing civilian clothes when he went out sometimes. So I'll just read the section about this sort of transition, if you like, from being a strict Theravadan monk to living more like a ordinary Westerner. In India, I had not once thought of wearing civilian clothes. That is, not since my going forth into the homeless state, and especially not since my formal ordination as a Buddhist monk. I always felt quite at home in the yellow robe, and in any case, in the socio-religious context within which I was then living and working, the question of my wearing anything other than the robe simply did not arise. People may have been somewhat surprised, initially, to see a Westerner wearing the yellow robe of the renunciant, but they at least knew what the robe signified, so that even though it happened to be a stranger who was the bearer of the message itself was perfectly familiar one, and communication between us could, therefore, be easily established. In Great Britain, the situation was entirely different. There, the yellow robe did not signify anything, though the shaven head might convey a suggestion of something vaguely medieval and ascetic. Even in cosmopolitan London, I had to put up with some strange looks, even with the occasional rude comments when travelling by bus or tube, especially if I happened to be on my own. Some people seemed to think I was in fancy dress. Others that I was wearing a sari underneath my cloak, or even that I was a transvestite. Thus it was with a distinct feeling of relief that, for the first time in nearly 20 years, I went out in civilian clothes. It was a relief to be able to walk down Charing Cross Road and around Soho, to have a cup of coffee without being stared at or feeling that I was being looked at out of the corner of somebody's eye. I have known Western Buddhist monks who did not mind being intruded on in this way, and who, in the case of one or two of them, not only enjoyed being the object of so much attention, but flaunted themselves and their yellow robes in a manner that was calculated to attract it. I was of a very different temperament from such exhibitionists. Far from wanting to attract attention, I sought to avoid it as much as possible. I wanted to be free to go about my occasions without being taken particular notice of by anybody. I wanted to be inconspicuous, to be lost in the crowd, to be the observer rather than the observed. Nobody at the Hampstead Vihara knew that I sometimes wore civilian clothes. Had the more decidedly Theravadan members of the Sangha Association known, they would have been scandalized. Yes, so through his friendship with Terry, Sangharakshita began to just live a more sort of ordinary Western life. He goes on to talk about how he then began to learn how to go shopping, for example, which he had no idea how to do that in Britain. He says, although he's back in the UK, living at the Buddhist Vihara, Buddhist monastery, it was like a kind of bubble within British society. So I'll just read that little section as well, and then we're close to finishing. While I had experienced no difficulty in adjusting psychologically to being back in Britain, the truth of the matter was that living as I did in the esoteric enclave that was the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara, I had little knowledge of what life in the workaday world outside was really like. Not only did I have no idea what sort of clothes to buy, doing the week's shopping and collecting laundry, as Terry and I did after walking around Soho and having a coffee, were novel experiences for me, the more especially as some of that shopping was done in a crowded and noisy street market, and I had not set foot in a laundrette before. To my friend, of course, such tasks as shopping and collecting one's laundry were only too familiar, and it was thanks to him that, as the weeks and months went by, these and 100 other concomitants of modern living became familiar to me. It was Terry, more than anyone else, who enabled me to make the transition to living in England, as distinct from living at the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara, just as 20 years earlier it had been the then Robin Banerjee who enabled me to make the transition to living in India. And for me, at least, this was an important element in our friendship. Yeah. It was only through kind of preparing this talk that I realized the import of that for us. Had Sangharakshita not made that transition from being a monk in the full sense to living more like a householder without being a layman, we, in our situation now, 50, 60 years on almost, would have had the model still of monk and lay. You're either a monk or a nun, or you're a lay person. And I think it's very, very significant that we as Dharma practitioners, especially members of the order, can consider ourselves as neither monk or nun or lay on the other hand. We're just Dharma practitioners. And I think that's tremendously significant because we can consider ourselves as full Dharma practitioners, that we're not somehow second-class Buddhists compared to monks or nuns, which would have been the case. In fact, that's still how many Buddhists from traditional Buddhism regard us. But I think for us, it's tremendously important for us to be able to consider ourselves fully practicing Dharma, Dharma practitioners. Yeah. Just to end, very tragically, I mentioned that Terry got very depressed at times, and that gradually worsened over the next 2 or 3 years following this. And he committed suicide in 1969, which was very, very, very sad. Yeah. And Sangharakshita was very, very hurt by that, naturally. In fact, he says right at the end of this book that he cried every night, every day for 6 months after Terry died. Yeah. So it's a very, very strong and important friendship for him. I think I better stop there. Gone over time anyway. And there was another friendship I was going to mention, but I don't have time for that. Yes.